But what does the book actually talk about? So this is it again. And so the key theme of this book is really the reconfiguration of the nexus of religion and nationhood in the contemporary Western society. So why is that an interesting theme? So if we think about sociologically about collective identities, of course, religion and nationhood are two of the main elements, two of the main modalities for which collectivities have been constructed in history, and both of these modes or both of these codes of belonging are often actually overlapping, reinforcing one another. Yet at the same time, in contemporary societies, this nexus of religion and nationhood has been challenged and has been reconfigured. So just think about the global dimensions of this theme. Think about, for instance, about Christian nationalism in the United States, think about Hindu nationalism in India, think about different types of Islamic or Jewish nationalisms. So here in all of these movements, we see, of course, a very sort of dominant construction of these overlaps between these two codes of belonging. And we see, of course, also the types of sources that come into these challenges. So processes of globalization, of course, have been relativizing national identities, have put them sort of into a global mosaic. New communication technologies have been facilitating global communication amongst diaspora groups of different kinds. And of course, immigration and processes of cultural and ethnic diversification have all played into the challenges that we see at the moment with regard to this nexus of religion and nationhood. And so the examples that I was giving, I would argue, Christian nationalism in the US, Hindu nationalism in India, Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, and so on, they don't really have a clear equivalent in what I call here the secular West, so especially societies in Europe and Canada that don't have a full equivalent. So of course, we do see sort of nativist Christian-inspired populisms in some of these societies, but they don't have the same kind of force as, for instance, Christian nationalism in the US. And so, of course, we see here that the religion nationalism nexus has been weakened in some of these societies by processes of secularization. Yet, as we see, the nexus of religion and nationhood is still operating, but in different and perhaps less visible ways. And so what I'm trying to look at here are the ways in which the nexus of religion and nationhood has been reconfigured in what is broadly understood in political science as stateless nations or nations without state. So let me say just a few words about the two case studies that I'm bringing into the conversation here, Quebec and Catalonia. So what is interesting about these so-called nations without state is that they kind of, also the argument I'm trying to present in this book, they kind of show us, like in a particular type of prism, the dilemmas and the contradictions that emerge from trying to foreground particular religious sources of nationhood, whilst at the same time remaining faithful to the tenets of liberalism, state neutrality, freedom of religion, liberal notions of human rights, and non-discrimination. And they do so because these societies are often have been suffering from historical oppression under a broader nation state of which they are part. So Quebecers in first sort of Canada as the British Dominion, then independent Canada, and the Catalans in the Spanish monarchy and then nation state. And so what we see here is a kind of situation in which these societies are also facing immigration, so they have to come to terms with the new sort of the potentialities and challenges of multiculturalism and immigration, while at the same time always trying to make sure that their cultural particularities, specifically those that are linked, of course, to their linguistic particularities, and the national identities that are formed around these linguistic particularities are kind of safeguarded. And so we see here, in fact, that what are challenges to what could be called the independent nation states are particularly foregrounded in these, if you will, dependent nation states. And so this is a bit the broader scenario that I look at. So I'll look at the ways in which living together between members of different religious communities, as well as secular and religious communities, is kind of changing, and specifically the way in which these forms of living together are actually regulated and governed, and how these forms of regulation and governance are experienced. And so having written that book, actually, I try to bring together perspectives from the sociology of religion with regard to the question, of course, of forms of religious belonging, perspectives from political sociology, where I look at the ways in which forms of nationalism and state formation play into forms of the governance of religion, but especially I look at all of these issues from the point of view of cultural sociology. So I'm interested specifically in the structures of meaning that shape perceptions of diversity, that shape perceptions of secularism, that shape perceptions of migration and conviviality. And to add a bit of more complication to that, I try to also integrate a few perspectives from what in the North American context is called social legal studies. So the ways in which law is actually becoming a dominant form of regulating and constructing collective identities, and of course also of contesting the claims of collective towards made in the name of collective identity in legal arena, specifically also in courts of law, and the consequences of specific legal rulings on the rights of cultural and religious communities for multicultural conviviality. So let me just pinpoint a few of the interventions that I'm really doing. So sort of going a bit. No, let me first say a few words about method, actually, perhaps that comes before here. So the book is really the outcome of a 5-year period of data collection in both Catalonia and Quebec. It was not sort of a one long period in each of these societies or places, but rather sort of a patchwork of different stays, amounting to around sort of eight months of stay in each of in Quebec and in Catalonia. And the method is really sort of what drawing on I think Genevieve Szubritsky used the term historic ethnography. I think I could use that label also for what I'm doing, although it's less historical, of course, than Genevieve's work. But so I'm trying to weave together different types of sources, including interviews, documents, legal documents, political documents, and other historical sources in order to present something of an ethnographic account of the governance of religious diversity in both societies. And so I think there's specifically, or we could say there's 4 main interventions that I'm trying to do with this book. So one is an intervention into the debate on diversity. So a lot of what's going on in society with regard to the relativization, if you want to use that term, or the unsettling of that notion, of that nexus of nationhood and religion. In other words, the idea that a nation has a dominant religion and forms of national belonging are kind of overlapping or even equivalent, equivalent's the wrong word, are overlapping or even kind of identical or coextensive, if that's the right word, maybe, with forms of religious belonging. So that idea has been unmade. So that idea, of course, has a historical precursor, which at least in the European context is, of course, the Westphalian system of nation states, independent nation state, where each nation state has a dominant religious tradition. Then there is, of course, a few mixed confessional countries kind of located in the middle of Europe, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany. but the others were as an outcome of the religious wars of the 17th century, religiously homogeneous. And so that idea of homogeneity lived on for a long time. And of course, it was never fully achieved. It was always enforced by violence and by different types of violence. But it continued to exist for a long time as an assumption, as a discourse. And so this idea of homogeneity, of course, is, as Wimmer and many others have shown, an element of the formation of modern nation states. Then in the 19th century, especially the idea that the political demos is identical with sort of the culture of the people. And so I guess part of a large part of the debate on diversity is, of course, also about unmaking this assumption, actually. So diversity, of course, has a lot of different understandings and different dimensions. So it is, of course, used in disability studies and queer studies and post-colonial studies and a lot of different studies. There's, of course, also diversity studies. So here, I want to sort of make that kind of biographical comment here, that this book, in fact, emerged from my research at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Göttingen, where I was really sort of engaging with diversity discourse in a more sustained way. And so I was looking here, in fact, not so much at sort of how diversity really became an element of Western societies, but rather the kind of work that the discourse or the understanding of diversity was actually doing in society. So the ways in which the idea of diversity was taken up in political discourses, was adopted into policy making, was making its way into the programs of different groups and so on. So I was interested, in fact, not so much in using the term diversity as a descriptive term, which allows us to sort of get to what's a more accurate description of societies as not religiously homogeneous, as not sexually homogeneous, as not homogeneous in terms of abilities and ableism and so on, but rather to look at what the term diversity, actually the way in which it operates to produce, to yield certain outcomes in the field of the governance of religion. And so my suggestion here was to move a little bit into the theoretical inspirations here, to look at diversity as a form of governmentality, which is to say to diversity as a term that actually operates by extending certain forms of governance, by naming, by classification and categorization. And then, of course, in that sense, to produce paradoxical results, given that, of course, the idea of diversity was, in fact, to move beyond certain categories, to move beyond an existing set of classifications, and then to look at the ways in which sort of the discourse on diversity actually has trouble in doing just that, actually. The next sort of intervention I'm making here with this book is into theories of secularization, secularism, and secularity. And here, of course, is the idea in the background that the governance of religion and of religious diversity in particular in many Western democracies, many Western societies, is understood to take place against a context in which state institutions have been secularized, that is, that they have become more autonomous from religious influences, from religious authority, but at the same time that the governance of religious diversity, its salience or its significance or the lack thereof in public debates has something to do with secularization understood as sort of, the decline of religious commitments and participation in collective religious ritual. And so again, here, the intervention is one that is linked, of course, a bit to my own biographical trajectory. So having having co-authored and co-authored a concept called multiple secularities, and having worked in a center that goes by the same name, where the general idea was to say what matters for our understanding of the governance of religious diversity is really not so much only a quantitative difference, how much religion is there. So to say, well, if we live in a society which is very, very religious, then we can expect this type of religious governance. But to say there's different forms of secularity, it's not so much the quantity, but the quality, the type of secularity that actually plays a role. And then that we do find different understandings of secularity in one and the same society that may compete with one another, that only under certain historical and social circumstances do we find something like a dominance of one particular understanding of secularity or secularism for that matter. So we think of, a certain period of republicanism in the Republic of Turkey, where you have a very sort of developed literature on Turkish secularism, or specific periods in India, specific sort of understandings of laicite in France, which have become very sort of, paradigmatic in a certain way, modeled as it were, and then again need to be unpacked. And as you know, as the outcome, as the always unstable outcome of the competition or contestation of different understandings of secularity. And so again, here in the cases of Quebec and Catalonia, I think we see very nicely how different understandings of secularity, and specifically the type of purpose of why one would need to live or want to live under secular governance actually are competing with one another. I just give you a quick example here from sort of fieldwork in Quebec. So in Quebec, I take this straight from the book, of course, there is an understanding of laïcité. I mean, there's even two words, laïcité, ouverte. So open laïcité that is defended by people who are in favor of the rights of immigrants, who are in favor of, rights of immigrants to use their religious symbols in public institutional domains and arenas. A laïcité that sort of is conforming to the broader Canadian framework of multiculturalism and so on, and is one that is not very much linked to a specific Quebec national identity. Whereas you have another form of laïcité which calls itself laïcité sans adjectif, like with laïcité without qualifier, which is defended by Quebec republicanists, who are sort of speaking out in favor of a more sort of a secular public sphere, which would be more emptied of what is understood to be particularistic religious identifiers, and where the idea is pretty much in line with French understandings of laïcité, to foreground citizens without their religious qualifications, but to see citizens as not culturally sort of marked and qualified. Qualified is the wrong word, marked. So you can see these two different understandings of laïcité being in contestation. I kind of trace the trajectory of these contestations in this book. The third intervention I'm making here is about space making. And so here the idea is that both religious and secular symbolisms, practices, activisms, and so forth all take place against the context of specific spatial formats or within certain spatial formats, and that these spaces actually shape the understanding and the outcomes of the kind of contestations I've been talking about. And I do this here really on two levels. So one, of course, is the very understanding or the very idea of looking at nations without states, so here Quebec and Catalonia, as two, if you will, specific spatial formats. So they're kind of not even annexed, not even annexed spaces of the nation state. You would say that they can be considered as internal spaces within national spaces. And so here I really make the point that specific forms of the governance of religious diversity and understandings of secularity in Quebec and Catalonia have to be understood, or can only be understood, by looking at the history of Quebec in the Canadian context, of Catalonia in the Spanish context, and that in fact, for instance, the governance of religious diversity in Catalonia is one that is fashioned sort of as a type of boundary work vis-a-vis what Spain is and how things are done in Spain and so on and so forth. And so that is sort of an argument which is sort of historical in a way. So we can see how the differences between Catalonia and Spain and between the Quebecers and Canada are, of course, not only kind of given by linguistic differences and so on, or by the fact that, you know, Catalonia is one of the economic powerhouses of Spain and so on, but also that these differences have always been fashioned on both sides, on the Spanish side, the Catalan side, and the sort of the Anglo-Canadian side and the Franco-Canadian side. And so that there is also a way in which, for instance, the fashioning of Quebec as laïque vis-a-vis Canada as multicultural and Anglo-multicultural in that sense is, of course, an outcome of the boundary work. So secularity is about boundary work. Laicite is about boundary work of reinforcing Quebec national identity vis-a-vis the idea of Quebec only being one sort of little stone in the broader mosaic of multicultural Canada. So the governance of religious diversity and the foregrounding of particular understandings of secularity and secularism are closely tied to the politics of national identity in both of these spaces. And so there is, we can say, sort of the spatial dimension which looks at sort of a subordinated national space within a broader, larger national container space, Spain and Canada. And then there is a sort of two chapters in this book which look at urban spaces in particular. And so there's a chapter that looks at the regulations, the often short-lived regulations of Islamic full-face veiling in both societies, and a chapter on the specific urban manifestations of the governance of religion. And so we can say that urban spaces, of course, in particular public urban spaces, are arenas within which religious identities are displayed or manifested, and which are often subjected to certain regulations and often restrictions when it comes to the use of religious symbols and so on, and of course which have a particular historicity to them. So public space, especially in all of Mediterranean Europe, are of course deeply marked by the history of Catholicism and its architecture, registrations and manifestations. And all of that actually has an influence. So public space has a deep influence of how societies and their codes of belonging are actually understood. So I make a series of arguments about urban space being not only a context or a material site within which sort of religious identities are actually marked and become durable and outlive in their durability the religious commitments of people. So architecture is that type of heavy medium actually, which remains, which is still there even after people's religious commitments may have been gone. But I also look at the ways in which urban spaces are actually regulated via practices of zoning, of the definition of land uses, and how land uses are actually subjected to certain criteria of diversity. So certain land uses are democratic in that sense that they say, well, we need to ensure that the right of freedom of religion is guaranteed by making it possible for people to access land to build a place of worship. So the whole question of places of worship as a manifestation of and as a yardstick of diversity is a major element here. And the final intervention, and I think, yeah, I'm almost coming to the end of my talk now here, is about heritage and the politics of religious heritage as another arena within which the politics of diversity plays out. And so that is, I guess, quite some of you will have sort of maybe followed a few of the debates on religion as heritage or culturalized religion or cultural religion, as it is often also termed. So religion as heritage is interesting because it actually refers, as I would argue here, to a modality of religion which can be distinguished from religion as practice, as personal devotion, so participation in collective ritual or collective prayer, but also a personal, more private engagement in personal prayer, for instance, but also to religion as belief. So religion as heritage is really about the writing forth of a particular type of religious lineage, which exists beyond personal commitment, beyond participation in collective ritual, but also beyond the collective commitment towards religion as a part of national identity. So we see actually that the politics of religious heritage, the foregrounding of particular monuments as sites of national heritage and identity, are very important sites when it comes to seeing how religion continues to matter and writes actually forth significance of religion beyond these well-established sociological dimensions through which we typically measure or understand the significance of religion in society. So heritage, I would say, in that sense here is really sort of a new modality of religion's social existence and social significance. It has its own sort of adherents. In other words, you have people who are deeply invested in religion as heritage or in religious heritage without actually being followers of religion. And in fact, the existence of religion as heritage makes its relevance or its dominance, like Catholicism's dominance, for instance, possible, while at the same time, or at least that's the construction, while at the same time remaining faithful to the tenets of liberalism, diversity, and neutrality. So the idea is really sort of how do you preserve sort of the special place of these majority traditions actually in society, traditions which have less and less followers, traditions that actually which should not dominate in public institutions because of the democratic principles of societies. So heritage plays a major role in the context of our ways of seeking answers to all these questions in sociology and anthropology. And so let me just conclude now by saying, so by contextualizing this effort a little bit. So I would say in many ways, Regulating Difference, this book really sort of shares a lot of ground with other people's, other sociologists and anthropologists' efforts to understand the continued significance of religion and secularity from a cultural sociological point of view. I'm thinking, for instance, of Jan Willem Duivendak and his collaborators in the Netherlands, who looked at similar questions from this point of view of what they call the nativist triangle, really looking at racial, secular, and popular nativism. And so part of the book, the ground that this book is covering here, to look at how part of the Catalans and Quebecers actually seek to secure some type of cultural dominance within a broader, diverse ethnic context is overlapping. But at the same time, I sometimes feel that this idea of nativism is also a little bit too generalizing, because it does not fully capture a lot of the ethnographic findings that I encounter when people engage in the preservation of churches and people engage in other heritage practices, and that does also not account for some other progressive policy making that we've seen in some quarters of the societies that I studied. Just a few words now on what has really remained outside the book, and what are the kind of things that I think I would like to take further, also have taken further and like to take further afterwards. So Kim Knibbe and Anna Fedele, in their most recent edited volume, actually talk about the triangle of religion, secularity, and spirituality. And I thought this was a really interesting and useful intervention that they made to look at the ways in which understandings of spirituality that really lie outside both the secular and the religious, as they are more institutionally framed, how spiritual practices may really sort of cross the boundaries between the secularity and religion. And I sort of took up this idea in a book chapter that I wrote for a volume, or is it somewhere here? I don't know. That was edited in Quebec. And I published an English version in Social Compass, where I look at the spiritual trajectories of people who otherwise, participate in secularist activism and push sort of towards a secular public sphere, who nevertheless show a commitment to spiritual practices. And so I think that is really a promising way forward, sort of to take away that to avoid mapping these terms religion and secularity really on people, on subjects, and to sort of understand people in this totalizing fashion, but to complicate these understandings in this way. The other part of the work that I was interested in, but that has remained outside of the book, are the politics of sexuality, of non-heteronormative sexualities. So when I started the study, I really thought it would be very interesting to look at the struggles of LGBTQI plus communities and the ways in which they intersect or do not intersect with a religious and secularist politics. And I did, at the time, quite a number of interviews with people who were engaged in queer religious communities, but also queer kind of secularist activisms in both Barcelona and Madrid, actually. And because it kind of fell outside of the sort of the frame that I had set myself for the case study, Catalonia, I left that outside, but I still believed it was a very interesting fieldwork to look at the politics of secularism, kind of following up and complicating a little bit Jasper Puar's notion of queer secularity. And so I did that, actually. I wrote that stuff down in a recent article that I published in New Diversities. And perhaps as a last comment, so what kind of self-critical, what really lay outside the book is the whole set of indigenous spiritualities that are important in the Quebec context, especially. And so that is something that is really sort of, is something that was just discovered very recently in Quebec discourse, so to say, as relevant and important for, Quebec national self-understandings, but it's also something where I actually didn't look enough actually to understand its significance for what I was writing about, especially the politics of religious diversity. So, and perhaps as a final note, so a question that I I struggled with, but perhaps I didn't fully engage with or deep enough, is really the question of what do we as sociologists and anthropologists do with the notion of neutrality. So what would a neutral state look like with regard to religion and spirituality? Is there something that we have to say instead of only studying how others understand neutrality? Is secularity somehow neutral? Can religion ever be neutral in a context of religious diversity? So these questions of neutrality remain relatively vexed, I believe, and I guess there's still a lot of debate, and perhaps I would also use that to invite you participants to perhaps also state from your point of view how you tackle these questions. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I would very much be looking forward to all sorts of questions, comments, and so on.